Hi folks, my name is Sarah. I'm the program manager for the Growing Indigenous Storytellers Fellowship here at JHR. Thank you so much for being on this call. I want to thank our lovely partners on this program, the Indigenous Journalists Association and APTN News. Just before we get going, just to let you know how this session is going to go, we're going to do about 25 to 30 minutes of Michelle talking, Michelle teaching us things, and then about 10 minutes of Q&A. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube, including the Q&A, so please feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go, and Michelle will kind of answer them as we go, or I can read them at the end during the Q&A portion, or raise your hand once that part starts. And without further ado, I will throw to Michelle.
Thanks, Sarah. So like Sarah said, my name's Michelle Cyca. I am a journalist in Vancouver. You can probably see it's really classic Vancouver weather today. It's like very gray and rainy outside. I'm also a member of Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, which is in Treaty 6, Saskatchewan. And for the most part these days, I know I'm talking about freelancing, but most of my time is spent working at the Narwhal right now, where I am the Bureau Chief of Conservation Fellowships. So there I focus on assigning and editing stories about Indigenous-led conservation, Indigenous sovereignty and rights, where those issues intersect with things happening on the land and water across what's commonly known as Canada. And I also oversee our fellowships programs. So we are in the process of recruiting an Indigenous journalist to work with in our newsroom for a year, which is really exciting in BC. And at the Narwhal, sometimes they let me write and report things, which is always really fun. Elsewhere, I freelance regularly for the Walrus, where I'm a contributing writer. I find sometimes journalism titles are opaque, so contributing writer means I'm still a freelancer. I'm not on staff, but I write regularly for them. Most recently, I had a feature that was published earlier this week about Indigenous midwifery and the resurgence of birth sovereignty and traditional birth and community. Which, full disclosure, took me 3 years to finish. Sometimes freelancing projects take a really long time. I do a mix of features and essays there. In 2025, just to give a sense of kind of what I've covered this year, I wrote about the 10-year anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report. I wrote an essay about parenting because I have 2 little kids. I wrote an Indigenous identity fraud, which is something I've covered before. And I also wrote about the explosion of communications and PR professionals and the decline of journalism. So that is just to say I have a pretty broad area of coverage. I think of myself as somebody who has a few niches in journalism, a few things I cover regularly, but I'm a bit of a generalist. I tend to write about whatever interests me at any given time. I also freelanced this year for Chatelaine. I wrote a piece about insomnia for them. And I occasionally am very lucky to do some literary criticism for the Globe and Mail. So I wrote about Sally Rooney's new novel that came out earlier this year. Other writing I've done recently, I wrote a book chapter for an upcoming anthology that I think will be announced soon and probably out late next year. And I do some teaching. So at the beginning of 2025, I taught my first class in the UBC Graduate School of Journalism, which was reporting in Indigenous communities. It's an incredible class that was created by Duncan McHugh, and he has this amazing book, which I keep by my desk, Decolonizing Journalism. And next month, I will start teaching a class on freelance journalism, which is a new class that I'm developing for the university, which I'm really excited about. So if you have any thoughts about what you think these students need to learn, please send them my way. I will incorporate it into my teaching, and I will give you credit if you want. To prepare for this, I actually looked back at the spreadsheet that I use to keep track of my work, which is maybe my first professional insight for you. Everybody has a different system for how they track things. I am a little bit old-fashioned. I mostly use a spreadsheet where I keep track of all my assignments and like what state they're in, how close to completion, when I need to file them. And so a few other things I did this year besides reporting, I judged a creative nonfiction essay contest for Event Magazine. I spoke on some podcasts, which I consider a professional activity, partly because they make me wake up really early in the morning, and I wouldn't do that for fun. And I moderated some events with the Vancouver Writers Festival, which I've gotten to do for a few years. And as somebody who writes literary criticism and reads a lot, it's always a lot of fun for me. And then when I'm not working, which is a portion of my life, despite all the things I just listed. As mentioned, I have two little kids, keep me really busy. They're 6 and 2. I spend a lot of time reading for fun and for work. I spend a lot of time running. I'm really lucky to live near Pacific Spirit Park in Vancouver, so I ran in the forest this morning. And I also serve on the board of Tapwewan Media, which is an Indigenous nonprofit media organization. They publish Indigenews, which is an incredible outlet. And I'm very fortunate to be a part of that and support their work. And I'm also on the board of Upstart and Crow Literary Arts Society, which is a bookstore here in Vancouver that supports literary programming and writer residencies. They're on Granville Island. If you're ever in the city, you should check them out. So it's a long list of things. I'm not just trying to fill time by talking about how I spend my days, but I think it's helpful to kind of get a sense for what the mix of work can look like when you're a freelancer. I feel really lucky that everything I do right now in my career are things I'm really passionate about with organizations that I really care about, that feel really values aligned for me. Um, and the mix changes every year. Some years I do more freelancing, more pitching, more writing. This year has been actually a little bit less than the year before. But the fact that the mix always changes, and that I'm adjusting it all the time feels kind of typical of a freelance career. You can adjust what you're doing based on sort of what fits your life right then. As somebody with small children, often that's dictated by how much childcare support I have. Um, I want to talk, I guess, a little bit about how I started freelancing. And I'll talk a bit about what it's like to freelance right now. But I often think we talk about careers in this sort of diametric way. I remember when I was 21 or like 22, thinking that you kind of had to pick what you wanted to do with your life and like choose a path, and it would progress linearly through a career. My mom had one job her whole life. She got it when she was 24 and she worked there until she retired. And that seemed normal to me. But I often think that it's more realistic to think about a career as something that can move in any direction and that can change all the time. At times I've been a full-time freelancer. At times I've done a little bit of freelancing while working another job. I have more of a conventional job right now and just do a little bit of freelancing on the side of that. But I think when people are interested in freelancing, you don't have to think of it as something you have to pick or something you have to do forever. I think of it as kind of a set of skills and processes that can kind of fit into your life. And in my opinion, if you want to work in media or journalism, it's really, really valuable to learn some fundamentals of freelancing because this industry is really unpredictable. It's very dynamic, and being able to kind of pivot or rely on yourself or find ways to self-direct your work or look for opportunities that serve you is, I think, a really valuable and resilient thing to develop. So I know there's non-journalists here, so I don't know if it's necessary to explain what freelancing is, but it's the state of working as a non-employee for a publication or an outlet. So sometimes that looks like getting assignments from an editor where they reach out to you and say, would you like to do this for us? Here are the details. And other times it involves pitching your own ideas, which is where you want to do something and you're trying to convince somebody to pay you for it. Earlier in my career, I did a lot of pitching, and now I'm lucky to have worked with some editors enough that they come to me with assignments that they think are a good fit. And I think that's pretty typical too. I started freelancing a really long time ago in 2011. Um, and I was in grad school at the time, and some friends of mine had started a magazine, a student magazine at the time. It's called Sad Mag. It still exists. It's an arts and culture magazine published in Vancouver. They publish online and they do 2 print issues a year. And I just thought it would be a fun creative outlet. It was very low barrier. It was very low stress because it was friends of mine and it was like a little student publication. So it felt like there was a lot of freedom to experiment and try things. I did some interviews, I did some profiles, I wrote weird little pieces for the issues. Um, and it really was fun to be involved in making a magazine. I think it really turned me into a print media fanatic. I love making a physical print product with friends. I love how collaborative it is. Um, and it also was kind of my first experience writing professionally, or semi-professionally. Through that, I met other people in Vancouver who worked in media. And I started doing little assignments for local media organizations, a lot of which don't exist anymore, which is really tragic. Um, but I learned some of the basics through that. I learned how to file on time. I learned how to stay on word count. I learned how to communicate with editors and how to invoice and how to follow up on an invoice and not just trust that the publication will remember to pay you. Um, and eventually I started getting the confidence to pitch bigger outlets. So pitching newspapers, national magazines. This whole time I was working in non-media jobs. I worked in health research. I worked in communications. And I think that there's similarly, like, as we talk about careers as kind of, you can be a freelancer, you can have like a conventional career. I think we also think you can go like all in on journalism or not. And a lot of people who freelance do more than one thing. Um, I think there's no shame or shouldn't be any shame in working a non-journalism job to support your freelance work or support your creative work, whatever you want to do. I know lots of amazing journalists who work in the service industry, who do tree planning, who work in retail, who take care of their kids or their parents. There are lots of kinds of work you can do and do journalism as long as there's no ethical conflicts or conflicts of interest. And I think that kind of work can deepen your reporting. It gives you connections to the world outside of journalism. So I think like no shame in having a non-journalism job. That's kind of my first piece of advice in a way. Um, I feel like I built a lot of relationships locally before I started freelancing more broadly. And I think the other thing I would emphasize for anyone who's interested in freelancing is to focus a lot on cultivating good relationships with everybody you work with. So editors, your fellow freelancers, other journalists in your community, go for coffee with people, socialize, make friends. It can be isolating for one thing to do freelance work if it's just you at home on your computer or in the field by yourself. But it's also just really valuable to remember that this is a relationship based kind of industry, like I guess like everything, but having a good relationship with your editors, not ghosting them if your assignment goes off the rails, not being rude to the person who processes your invoices or the fact checkers, just trying to cultivate a good reputation for yourself is so important because journalism and media are very small industries. People talk, and if you're a good person to work with, if you're communicative, if you're thoughtful, if you file on time, filing on time is very important. Um, and, if you're respectful during the editing process, I think these are all things that really help your career in the long run. Speaking as someone who does a lot of assigning now and works with freelancers, um, that kind of like personal aspect of it, knowing that they're reliable and that they're pleasant to work with goes a really long way. A lot of things in reporting, like small things, spelling errors, those can all be fixed or addressed in editing, but you can't fix a bad attitude. Or it's not your job to as an editor. Um, so I worked other non-media jobs actually until 2022. And at that point, I realized I had freelanced enough and built enough relationships, done enough kinds of work that I felt like I could quit my job and freelance full time. People have different thresholds for when they're ready to make that leap. For me, a big thing was that I had a daughter at the time who was almost 3, and I really wanted to ensure that I could continue to pay for childcare and have some sanity and stability in my life before I made that leap. Um, but I did that in early 2022. And then a big thing that happened for me that year is that I applied for a literary journalism program at the Banff Center because I had a story I really wanted to write that was really like hard to get my head around. It was an investigation, but I had sort of a personal element in my idea and I didn't really know how to do it. And so I thought if I did this program and I had some mentorship and some time to work on it, I could get my head around it. Um, and I got into that program, and I would encourage anyone who's interested in a freelance career, especially if, like me, you don't come from a journalism background, apply for opportunities like that. I mean, the fellows in this program have already taken this advice, but there are grants, there are fellowships, there are programs through places like the Banff Center. There are different funding opportunities. All of these are things you should be applying for because for one thing, these programs exist to give you opportunities and money. I feel like people often have imposter syndrome about applying for funding, but like giving a funder a great project to spend their money on is a gift to them as well as to you. Um, and it can be really transformative. So I feel like people second guess themselves. I was really grateful to have a friend, a journalist friend, Karen Pinchin, who encouraged me to apply for the BAMP Center and who read my application and gave me feedback on it. Because that was actually a really transformative opportunity for me. I went in the summer of 2022. I did what is my first big investigative story. It was a story about an artist named Gina Adams who had been hired at the university I used to work at under a targeted hire for Indigenous faculty members. There were concerns that she wasn't Indigenous, and as an Indigenous person who also comes from, I have a mixed background. I I was alarmed by her story and I wanted to figure out how to report it. And so I wrote a piece about Indigenous identity fraud, about what it felt like to be an Indigenous person in an institution that's dealing with it. Um, and I did it through the BAMP Center under the mentorship of an amazing writer, Carol Shaben. And when I came out, I sold that story to Maclean's magazine. It was my first cover story. They published it in September 2022. It won a National Magazine Award for investigative journalism. And it's led me to report on that topic a lot since then. It always feels embarrassing to talk about your own awards, but I mention it because I feel like one big story, one piece that you're really proud of that you pour yourself into can be really transformative for your career. And that was something that I was lucky to have support and mentorship on, but it was a really big story that I felt like only I could write. Like it felt like something that I had conceived of, that I had a particular perspective on. And so I, yeah, I would encourage everybody who's interested in freelancing. This is kind of a third piece of advice, just to spend your energy really carefully. Like think about what you actually really want to do, what you feel like you're sort of uniquely qualified to explore, or what you're passionate about, what you can't stop thinking about. Um, and focus your work on that, because I think it's both personally rewarding to spend your energy that way, and anything that you do professionally at scale, you will be asked to do more of. Reporting on Indigenous identity issues, they're very ubiquitous in the media now, and I get asked to do more reporting on that. I don't always say yes because I find that topic actually really draining personally and emotionally, but doing some reporting on something will create other opportunities to report on that same issue. And so I think it's important that people consider whether a topic or a subject or a person or an issue is something they would want to be working on at length. And if it isn't, I would encourage them to explore other subjects. I think it's easy when you're starting out in a freelance career to just like try and get a byline anywhere, try and get a story anywhere. And that can be valuable, but what you do a little bit of, you'll be asked to do a lot of. So spend your energy carefully. In 2023, I started working at the Narwhal. I've been there since. I've continued freelancing and doing lots of other things. Um, I feel like the industry has changed a lot even since I started freelancing. I mean, especially since I started freelancing in 2011, but even in the last couple of years, it's really changed. A big way that it's changed now is, I mean, there are many things we could say about it. Social media has changed both how people consume news and how media reaches people. In Canada, you can't see news on Facebook or Instagram. A lot of people aren't aware of that. You on Google, if you search a news story, will get served like an AI Google summary that encourages you to stay on Google and not read the actual reporting. So a lot of media outlets are kind of grappling with this decline in audience and this pressure to use AI to make their reporting more efficient. You can see this kind of in the pressures that media organizations are under. So a lot of them rely more on freelancers. They have fewer staff positions, but they also have fewer resources to support those freelancers, which can be really challenging. Because editors are overworked. A lot of publications don't have the budget for copy editors or fact checkers, so there's like a higher burden on the reporter to get everything right. And the change in social media ecosystem, I would say, has also impacted freelancers as well as outlets. So even a couple years ago, I got quite a bit of work through Twitter, which is embarrassing to say now. But I I was on there a lot. I had a sizable audience, and sometimes I would post something and it would get enough traction that an editor would message me and ask if I wanted to write about that for them. My second cover story for Maclean's actually came out of a viral tweet that I made about housing prices in Vancouver. And I ended up doing a really big reported story for them on homeownership and the wealth gap between people who are property owners and people who aren't. And that came out of social media. And I have a bunch of other like smaller assignments that came the same way. I really don't think that ecosystem exists anymore, which is a depressing thing to say. Um, Twitter is like a terrible Nazi bot farm now. There are other platforms that are useful. I think being on social media and having a web presence for freelancers is really valuable. At the very least, if you want to be a freelancer, you should have a website with your name and a little bit about you and any stories you've done. You should make it really easy for an editor to Google you and like confirm that you're a real person. Um, but I think that's just something to navigate too, is that the way people use social media, the expectations and audiences there have changed a lot. And I say that partly because I think there's no real one template to building a freelance career. Mine looks different than somebody who would be starting now. Um, but a lot of it is about recognizing where you feel like you have a fit and that you feel rewarded or like engaged in your efforts there. I really liked Twitter because it was it was a fun place for me at the time to test ideas, like to write a little tweet and see what sticks in people's heads, to see what people were talking about in regard to an issue I was thinking about, to have conversations, to connect with editors. I really like that. I know lots of journalists who didn't like it, but who maybe really enjoy TikTok. They enjoy doing video explainers. They like being on Substack and writing at length about issues they're thinking about and turning those into paid assignments. Um, so don't force yourself to spend more time on social media than you need to. But if you find it a valuable place, I think it can be really generative. Um, as long as you're not on Twitter, which sucks now. Another key thing that I want to mention, because I've been thinking about it a lot, and I think a lot of people probably are, is the AI plague, the AI revolution, some might say. There's a really amazing story published recently that I would encourage everybody to look up by Nicholas Brown, who is an editor at The Local. And he wrote about getting a pitch that seemed great, assigning it. Oh, Ryan, I'm going to answer your question after I tell the story. Um, he assigned this freelancer, and then he started getting kind of a weird feeling. And the more he looked into it, the more he became convinced that she was either like an AI bot or somebody using AI to misrepresent herself and her work. He does a really good investigation. Um, and part of what's revealed is that she's actually managed to publish things at other outlets that were clearly at least partially written through AI or fabricated in other ways. Um, and it can be a depressing piece. Like Nick's takeaway from it is kind of depressing. He's concerned that, it's harder to trust new freelancers in your inbox because you don't know if they're real. Definitely as an editor, I see a lot of AI generated pitches and emails, which are really off-putting. Please don't use AI ever to email an editor. I'm just going to say like a hard line, don't do it, never worth it. Um, but I think that's why focusing on building relationships elsewhere, I mean, if you have local media or like fellow journalists to connect with, building your own network and connections is a really valuable way not only to establish like a toehold in a new freelancing career, but also to establish yourself as a real person, because I think trust now is such an important part of the media industry. I think a lot of outlets, a lot of editors are really nervous about being suckered by some AI generated content. And so, again, I think building those relationships is really key. Um, and I see that
Um, I,
oh, yeah.
do you do, do you feel like there's any like you said what you just said about AI and editors being apprehensive? Do you feel like the same thing's happening with pretendians?
To a big degree, I do.
Yeah.
I mean, different kinds of problems, but I think, I mean, I hope at least that editors are a bit discerning about Indigenous identity. Like another issue that I've seen and encountered is I think a lot of reporters will try and find an Indigenous voice for a story where necessary. They want to talk to like somebody local who can speak to an issue. And sometimes I see that they've talked to someone who's presenting themselves as Indigenous, but like only seems to be Indigenous in this like vague online ungrounded way where they have no community
I think
connection.
that's how like they signed the treaties, actually. Just kidding.
Yeah, we have no more authentication methods than we did in the 1870s. Um, I mean, I think that's where too, like I will talk, maybe I'll talk now about freelancing as an Indigenous journalist because I think like that goes two ways too. I feel like often editors or like journalists who are reporting are looking for someone to be like the Indigenous voice of their story in a really shallow way. Or an editor's like, we need an Indigenous perspective on this. And there are people out there who are happy to position themselves as like the Indigenous voice. They want to be like the spokesperson. And it's a shallow form of engagement all around. I think it is one of the factors that encourages this kind of like tokenization of identity. Um, and I have a lot of concerns about it as a journalist. Like, I feel like when a new editor outlet reaches out and asks me to write something, and it's clear they've just looked up like Indigenous journalist and they want me to write about something that has like nothing to do with the community I live in or the community I'm from, that's just like a different Indigenous nation or an Indigenous issue that I have no personal connections or insight into, it feels really tokenizing. It feels really bad. I think it's something that a lot of Indigenous journalists encounter a lot. I have a friend who told me she started replying to emails to be like, why did you reach out to me? And really make them think about what they're engaging with. But I think it's like that feels like kind of an endemic problem, you know? To me, the phenomenon of pretendianism is really rooted in the ways that Indigenous identity has been commodified, largely for like private and institutional benefit, right? It's valuable for institutions to be seen as diverse, to have Indigenous people there, to have like an Indigenous person in a visible role. And they don't care often too much about where that person is from, what communities they're part of. Arguably, it's easier for them if they have an Indigenous person on staff who isn't like politically connected to an Indigenous nation because those people can be difficult. They have other political values, maybe, than the institution's values. Um, and I think journalism and media should be really wary of that too. I think they should be cautious about just looking for people who are happy to be sort of a pan-Indigenous voice in a story. I'm not sure if that answers your question, right? Um, but yeah, I know we're kind of short on time. I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about freelancing as an Indigenous journalist because I think it's valuable even if you're not an Indigenous journalist. These are things that I would like to say to media generally. Indigenous people are really underrepresented in Canadian media. The Canadian Association of Journalists puts out a diversity survey every year. And so you can look at the data. It looks like Indigenous journalists are likelier to leave media. They're especially underrepresented as you go more senior levels of the industry. So you might have a fair number of interns or entry level roles, but as you move into management or senior editorial positions, there are fewer and fewer. In my experience, it's rare to have more than one Indigenous person in a newsroom. I'm really lucky at the Narwhal that I have on my team an amazing Squamish journalist, Stephanie Katassel-Wetwood, and we work closely together. But that's actually kind of rare, and especially given that the Narwhal has like fewer than 40 staff. But it's so it can be really isolating. And I think a challenge that you encounter if you're a freelancer is that if an outlet is coming to you partly because they want your lens on something as an Indigenous journalist, um, you're doing a lot of extra work besides the reporting. Like you're being asked often to be a kind of cultural translator. If it's a story that touches on something like intergenerational trauma or a tragedy, you're being asked to do a lot of like complex emotional work in that reporting. Often you're working with an editor who's not Indigenous, who maybe isn't familiar with Indigenous issues. And so it's hard to get adequate support in that. And you're often being asked to draw on your personal identity in a way that I think can be intrusive. I do personal journalism, I do essays, I write about my life. But I think it's important to be cautious when you're asked to do that because it can be really exploitative. You can be asked to really like draw on aspects of your life that are intimate or personal or painful for often was not an adequate amount of money or an adequate amount of support. And Indigenous journalists are still targeted disproportionately by online harassment, we are living in an era of residential school backlash. And every time I write about something that touches on residential school, I get the most like eye-meltingly terrible emails and responses. That's a terrible thing to deal with. Um, and I feel supported to deal with that. I feel prepared to deal with it. I expect it now, but I think it can be really challenging if you're a freelancer and you don't have the security and stability of a team, and you are put in the position of reporting a story like that and dealing with any backlash or response all by yourself, dealing with supporting the sources in your story. I think that publications should be thoughtful about how they engage with Indigenous freelancers. And I would really encourage everybody, if you're put in this position where you feel like you're being asked to put something on the page that demands more from you than just your professional skills, and you don't trust that you have adequate support to do that and to be cared for in that process, I would encourage you to say no. I think it can be scary to say no as a freelancer, but I feel like it's um, it's valuable to draw those boundaries. I think that they're worth more than usually whatever the story fee is these days. And it's important to do work that fulfills you. So I might leave it there. I know we might have other questions, but I appreciate everybody bearing with me. Talking for 35 minutes is a long time.
It's a long time. Thank you so much. That was fabulous. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, please either drop them in the chat and I can read them out, or just, raise your hand or jump in. There's not that many of us, so jumping in is absolutely an option.
Is there an industry standard fee scale for freelancers? Ryan, I love this question. And I will also find for the chat, I wrote 2 Medium posts in 2022 and 2023 about my income and earnings that break down like exactly how much I got paid for the year. I didn't do it last year just because I didn't have time, but I would say there's still kind of a standard that's like $1 a word for print media, like print magazines in Canada. If you're dealing with a national magazine, online rates tend to be lower, but not always. So for instance, Chatelaine now pays $1 a word for all reported features, whether they're online or in print. The Walrus does the same. Often the story determines the rate. So generally rates are better for like reported features and investigations than like essays or things that are considered sort of less reported, less heavily reported. Online, I feel like rates generally range from like 50 cents a word, thereabouts. At the Narwhal, we pay $1 a word for reported stories if you want to pitch us. And then sometimes smaller outlets, like more independent outlets, will pay lower rates. And I would say the rate is an important factor, but it's not the only thing that I consider when I'm looking at whether or not to do a piece. I'm often thinking like, is this something I really want to do that I'm really excited about? Is it an opportunity to work with an editor or publication that I would really like to collaborate with? Do I have a degree of creative control here? Like, is it fun? That's a big one. And like, does it feel professionally valuable for me? Like, will it give me a skill or an experience, or like allow me to break into a new niche that I would really like to be in? Those are all things I think about, like feature stories, anything where you're spending a lot of time and like a lot of words on a topic. If you break down how much you're getting paid by the hour, it can be really dismal. But those stories can be so valuable because like you're learning so much. You have a lot of space to like really develop your writing skills and your storytelling skills. You learn a lot that you can use for other reporting. So they're often the worst investment dollar-wise, but I think like they can be the best investment in your career as a journalist. So TLDR, no firm standard for rates, but think about the holistic value of a piece when you're deciding if the rate is good. Let's see.
Do you want to read this? Yeah.
Yeah. Lenny's question is, how do you develop story ideas, and when do you know if it's ready to be pitched? When it's ready to be pitched. I feel like some people have trouble coming up with story ideas. I don't understand what that would be like because I feel like I constantly have like 8,000 semi-crazy things that I would like to write about. I find everything interesting. So in terms of developing a story idea, I mean, often it's like if you find something really interesting, if it's a story that you're telling to a friend and they're like, that's fascinating, and you don't see anybody covering it, that's a great story right there. If there's something that's kind of in the media ecosystem that people are talking about, but you feel like there's an important piece missing and you have a thought on that, that's a story idea. Um, I think it's really like, is this interesting? Not just to you, but to other people. And does it feel like a story that should be told now? Um, Editors are often thinking about timeliness. It's not the only thing that we're thinking about, but it does matter. Like, if there's a timely element, that really helps. Or if it just feels like an interesting story that nobody has written yet, that can be really valuable too. Um, in terms of when a pitch is ready, I often think if you have anything that's timely, like that feels like it's a current event or something that's like coming up, the best time to send the pitch is as soon as possible. Don't labor over it too much, because the longer you dwell on it, like the more you risk missing that moment where it feels really urgent and really like important. And also, I tend to think people labor too long on their pitches. Your pitch should be conversational. It should ideally sound like the piece that you want to write. It should sound like you, and like a pitch that's timely and to the point is valuable than like one that you've labored over for 2 weeks that comes a little bit too late. Um, in terms of preparation, I think you should be sending a pitch when you know what the story is that you want to tell. So ideally, you should know a little bit about where it's going. You don't need to have the full thing reported or planned out. But you should know definitely that you can deliver on the story that you're pitching. So often that involves like making sure you can talk to the key sources you need to talk to and that you know who those people are, that you know what's been reported on the subject already, so that you have a bit of a sense of like what's already been done, especially if that publication has covered something similar. Like make sure you're not pitching something they've already covered. That you know enough about what you're pitching again that you can demonstrate that you have like the familiarity or the insight to do a good job of reporting it. So that can require some research or reading. Um, and again, that you understand like how you want to tell it. I think it's not uncommon to be working on a story and realize like it's not quite the story you thought, or that you didn't really have your head around the issue and you're like learning something on the way. Often you can salvage that in a reported piece, but it's always better not to go back to your editor with like something totally different than what you pitched. And the best way to avoid that is just to make sure like you have a sort of reporting plan in mind, that you know a bit about the destination you're trying to head to. And once you have those things in place, you should send a pitch. Oh, Rose, I love that you're raising your hand. Thank you.
Yeah, so I was wondering, so like could some I'm trying to find how to place my words here. Like if like being a credible like reaching out to sources as a freelancer, if like is it important to have kind of a lot of like a background for people to like find out about you before trusting to speak with you if you're not coming like with us we're stationed at APTN, so when we're reaching out to sources like we have a like I'm saying I'm with APTN, I'm represented by this, but when you're representing yourself, like do you find that are people like is that difficult to get people to talk to you if they're like who am I like where am I going to be using my voice here?
It can be more difficult, I think, if you don't have like a publication behind you that gives some weight to the request. So it can help often if you're reaching out to people after you've placed the story with a publication, or if you know where you'd like to pitch it, that can help. I think it often depends on the source. Like a lot of people I find are happy to talk about their work, especially if you explain like who you are and why you want to talk to them. In my experience, like experts, if you're talking to a scientific expert or like a community member, they're often just happy to chat about their work if you're asking them about things that they work on professionally and you have good questions and you're like really interested in what they're doing. It can be definitely harder if you're trying to talk to like a politician or a public figure, somebody who is kind of restricted in their time and maybe like discerning with what they grant to media. But I tend to like when I send emails, if it's for a story that I haven't placed yet, I say like, I'm a journalist. I'm working on developing a story about this. Here's why I'd like to speak to you. Like, here's some of my past publications. Like I tell them where I've been published before. So you could say I've worked with ABTN. And then if I have an idea of where I'd like to pitch it or where I think I can place it, I'll say like, I'm planning to pitch the story to the Globe and Mail. And that can help. But I don't find it's usually a make or break for people. especially if it's clear, I think, in the request that like you're coming to them for a story. Like if you have a clear request for why you want to speak to them and what you want to talk to them about, as opposed to like, I find whether you have a publication or not, people are more likely to say no if it's like, I want to talk to you about your work. Like, and they can tell that you haven't really put a lot of thought into it yet, or they don't know what the story is.
Awesome. Thank you for answering that. And I was also wondering another question about because I've always been curious about this with like reading like personal stories from freelance journalists. That is always something I've been interested in. And but how would you like how would you go about pitching a story that is like a personal story of of an experience that you had yourself? And like would you typically like would you need your own kind of like is that like a blog style thing that
No, I mean, I think like there's a couple ways to do it. You can write like a traditional essay, I think, which is just like you reflecting on your experience. Or there's lots of reported stories where I think it's valuable to bring yourself into it if you have a personal connection. I think editors, especially from freelancers, are often looking for that kind of voice and like lens on an issue that helps people connect to something like through the experience of the person writing it. Um, so, I mean, Kirsten Williams, who's on this call, wrote a really beautiful story for the Narwhal about going to a hide tanning camp. And it's an incredible story about hide tanning, and like the cultural practice of hide tanning, but it's also like a personal story, about Kirsten's experience there. It's on the Narwhal if anyone wants to read it. Um, and I feel like that's a great example of how you can write a reported story, but you can be in it if it makes sense for you to be like a voice that's guiding the character or the reader through it as a kind of character. Um, and I think otherwise, if you just want to write about something that you experienced or like something that you're thinking about where it's really your personal lens on it, the pitch is just about explaining to the editor, like, or making it clear you don't want to explain it like this is interesting because like you would like the interest to come through in how you pitch. But just if it's something that's like interesting enough that people would want to learn about it, I think like there are lots of experiences like that. Um, and I think as long as it's, again, I think the test often of like telling your pitch or your story idea to a friend and seeing like what lights them up and what they find interesting about it or what they have questions about, that can often help you figure out like how would I pitch this to an editor? Because really what you're trying to tell them is like, here's why somebody would read about this. So it's just finding those moments or those like themes that would connect to people, and draw them in.
awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, great questions.
But we've got time for one more, if anybody has one.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Kirsten. Um, Hi, Michelle. Long time. I haven't seen you in a long time.
Oh,
Sorry, my camera's not working right now, but it's because I have Microsoft Teams, and for some reason it messes up with Zoom. But yeah, Michelle, I was listening to you in the beginning there, and you had talked about a story that you just wrote about Indigenous. I always mess up how to say it, but midwifery. Is that how you say it?
that
Yeah.
is.
Okay. Yeah. And I actually saw this session and stuff on Blue Sky. I'm trying to get into that more than Twitter because Twitter, like you said, is a cesspool. But I'd planned to read it this weekend, and I was wondering, you talked about how you spent 3 years
Mhm.
kind of working on this story, and I was wondering, what did that look like over those 3 years? And you obviously had this idea and this thing that you really wanted to write about.
Mhm.
So I was wondering, like, how did you develop that story, and maybe why it took the 3 years to report on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I I started thinking about this partly because I was pregnant with my son when I was working on it, my younger child, who's 2.5 now. And I was just, like I said, I live in Vancouver, which is a major urban center, and there's very few Indigenous midwives here. So if you're an Indigenous person, you're generally being cared for by a non-Indigenous midwife. And I had great non-Indigenous midwives, but at one point they had this question for me where they were like, are there any cultural or like ceremonial aspects of like pregnancy or birth that you'd like to incorporate? And I was like, well, how would I do that? Like, how would I do that for myself? These are like community rooted things. Like I can't I can't provide them to myself. Who would provide them to me? And that made me just start thinking about the ways that birth is kind of dislocated from culture for a lot of us. And um, I was reading about these really beautiful stories of people who were giving birth in community, like often the first baby born in community for like 50 years or 60 years. And just thinking about how different communities are addressing this desire that a lot of people have to give birth in a setting that feels culturally grounded, where they're surrounded by ceremony, where they're welcoming a baby into the world, in their language, surrounded by family. So I worked on that story for like 3 or 4 months. I wrote a full feature. I spoke to like over a dozen midwives. And then I had my baby. My editor had a baby. And it just kind of lost some momentum. Like it didn't feel quite like there was like a timely reason. It felt too broad and like not there were lots of great like pieces to it, but it didn't feel like it was like rooted in time in a clear way. So it just went on the back burner for a long time. And I kept thinking about it. I would like follow up with these wonderful midwives and say, like, I'm still thinking about this story. And then a couple months ago in the summer, I spoke with a midwife on Vancouver Island who's midwifery, like they had the only Indigenous midwifery clinic on Vancouver Island. It's run by 2 Métis midwives, and they lost their funding from Island Health. So they were being defunded. They couldn't support clients anymore. And it's terrible, but it also like really refired my interest in the story. And I was like, this is like something that's happening now. And last year, the Northwest Territories cut half of their territorial midwifery positions, which is actually a climate story because they had crazy wildfires in Northwest Territories. And the costs from those were so high that the government has to cut all these other programs to make up the budget, which included slashing the number of midwifery positions in the territory from 8 to 4. So I felt like I had sort of a framework again where I could talk about how like the federal government has promised for years and years now to invest in Indigenous midwifery, to invest in birth sovereignty, to uphold the call to action and the truth and reconciliation support for Indigenous people to access culturally safe care, and just why governments were failing to deliver on that promise. And that gave me like a framework to revisit the story. So I did some re-reporting. I had to go back to a lot of people I talked to. I would not recommend this for a feature story because it's so much work to basically have to write it twice. But I was really, really glad to find a way back into it. And I mean, I do feel like often you have a story idea that you're working on and it's just like not quite the right moment, or you can't figure out like what the story is right then, but you can just hold it in the back of your mind. And like, I like to trust now that there will be a right time for every story. So that's a long explanation of why that one took 3 years.
Thank
for
you.
asking.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting that you kind of, had come up with this idea years ago and it kind of, might have needed just the right moment to come out. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Excellent. And we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. This has been such a joy. If you have any feedback, please feel free to send it to canadian.programs@jhr.ca. That's in the chat as well. We've got 2 more of these kind of guest sessions happening next Friday and the one after, and then we'll be wrapping up for the year. So if you would like to join, please stay tuned to IJA and JHR social media channels. And again, thank you so much for being here.